Hello, everyone. Today I had the pleasure of speaking with Dr. John Gibbs. He is a moral developmentalist at The Ohio State University. A moral developmentalist is a branch of psychology that studies how morality develops in stages. These stages are derived from Jean Piaget's landmark work in developmental psychology, where his observations led him to argue that a child's cognition develops in stages and that these stages are unique and somewhat invariant, though there is much debate about that. More specific to this episode, a moral psychologist named Lawrence Kohlberg incorporated Piaget's stage theory and argued that morality must also develop in stages as morality is cognitively constructed. This realization led Kohlberg into developing the stages of moral development. This theory captivated Dr. Gibbs, and after acquiring his Ph.D. from Harvard University in 1972, he worked closely with Kohlberg throughout the 70s. During this time, he revised Kohlberg's work in a more Piagetian sense, arguing that morality develops in stages, but these stages are more cognitive and affective, whereas Kohlberg's theory was more rooted in reasoning and cognition. Ultimately, this revision would influence one of Gibbs's finest work, his EQUIP program. This is a program that aims at reducing juvenile delinquency through moral rehabilitation. While the results vary, the literature would agree that EQUIP is indeed a success on top of being a fascinating program given its uniqueness. In this episode, we discuss more so about the EQUIP program, its past, its successes, and its future. Additionally, we go through Dr. Gibbs' academic history and take a deep dive into his past, which to a certain extent makes up the history of psychology itself. He has incredible stories to tell. Our conversation ends with a more theoretical approach to morality and its development. If these topics interest you, you will find this conversation deeply intriguing. And if you'd like to read about the topic of moral psychology or moral development, then I would recommend you consult Dr. Gibbs's book, Moral Development and Reality, Beyond the Theories of Kohlberg, Hoffman, and Haidt. Not only is this book deeply informative, but it is also a pleasure to read, and the last two chapters discuss the very nature of reality itself, which is a topic that not many psychologists venture into. This book is well worth your money. A link to buy his book is in the description. And now, with all of that said, here's my conversation with Dr. John Gibbs. Dr. John Gibbs, thank you very much for taking the time to do this episode. I really appreciate it. So, before we dive into the grand topic of moral psychology, I was wondering if you could give us a brief background on your academic history. So, like, where did you go for your postgraduate work, and how did you transition into moral psychology slash development?
Well, I go back to the 60s, and I was at Princeton, and I want to mention the most pertinent experience, which is a beautifully written textbook that I got into in one of the courses in psychology by Roger Brown, and I think that was really, I didn't realize that at the time, but I I, I can locate that as really the start of my intrigue with questions about morality and moral development and human development in general. Um, so I graduated in 68 and went on to Harvard thinking that I was going to work directly with Brown. It didn't work out that way. I worked with someone else who was also excellent in his field, Herbert C. Kellman, who was just a superb analyst of social influence processes. But I took a seminar uh, during the Harvard years of 68 to 72. And in that seminar, um, the seminar it was a pro seminar in developmental psychology, and it was co-taught by Jerome Kagan and Lawrence Kohlberg. And I'm thinking, Leica kind of goes on. I'm thinking, wait a minute. I was reading in Brown's textbook about Kohlberg as someone who was supplying the intellectual dimension of morality that was missing in Freud. And so that was really intriguing to me and exciting to be directly exposed to Kohlberg and his idea of stages and so on. And that was really sort of the origin of my interest, a little bit about my undergraduate and graduate history, and especially in connection with the beginning of my interest in this idea of morality as something that involves cognition as well as feeling, as something that involves a kind of a growth beyond superficial levels of understanding. And to this day, I mean, that's been my intrigue, and I even related, and we can get into the idea that this even involves what I call existential development, which is morally relevant, and so we can talk about that as well. But so that's my bailiwick these days. It's been since going all the way back to the 1960s.
Okay, and just as like a sub question, what did Kohlberg say was missing from Freud's theory in terms of morality? Because in Civilization and Discontents, he was saying that morality evolved as some type of protection against like intergroup conflict. So it's very primitive. So what did he want to add on to that?
Well, it's interesting, and when you mention about civilization's discontents, I mean, I read that too and was intrigued by it. That this notion that we're basically affective, id-driven animals, and but civilization is crucial for human survival, and so these raw desires get sublimated into constraint and higher values of civilization. And Freud thought that that was a good thing. He said, "Yeah, we're all neurotic because but that's the price, right, of civilization." And then, of course, as you may know, Marcuse and others came along and said, "What's so great about civilization? Why don't we just let it all hang out?" So that was one issue that Freud inspired. But regarding the intellectual dimension, what Brown did was come along and say Freud's picture is kind of one-sided, and that morality involves not just these raw feelings that get sublimated, but Freud did not take the intellectual, the cognitive aspect of morality as seriously as he should have. He didn't give that a substantive role. It was sort of epiphenomenal, pity the poor ego. And so I was intrigued that Brown was describing work that Piaget did, and then based on Piaget, Kohlberg, to try to right the balance a bit. And that's what I meant about this intellectual dimension that Brown thought was missing in Freud. And so, when I was at Harvard, and lo and behold, here is the professor, Lawrence Kohlberg himself, I was thrilled and intrigued, and to carry the story a little bit, I spent a few years after graduating with the doctoral degree in '72 from Harvard. I went for a few years at McMaster University, and to my excitement, my thrill, Kohlberg invited me back to join his longitudinal project, and so that was so then my wife and I came back to Harvard in the late '70s, and as far as there was an evolution that took place at that point when I started to realize that although Kohlberg was building this intellectual dimension missing Freud, he kind of wasn't doing it quite right as far as I came to see. I was in working on his data with the longitudinal project. I started to sense that there were some issues and some problems that needed to be remedied, and so I wound up doing a revisionist model for the stages, and I can go into that too. But anyway, that's rounding out the origins picture, I guess. In the '70s, there are really two Harvard episodes: one as a graduate student, and then coming back as a research faculty working with Kohlberg.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for clarifying that. I find it's
Yeah.
interesting to see like the history of psychology when it goes back, because like in the '60s was very different as it is now. Okay, so what did you kind of I guess polish up from Kohlberg's theories? Like, what are the stages, and how did you kind of implement your touch to it?
Well, one thing that Kohlberg was contending with was criticism that his theory was elitist, that it was Western biased, that it was, that it wasn't in touch with cross-culturally general sequences in moral thought. And I started to become sympathetic to that critique, and felt that where Kohlberg went wrong, perhaps, was his effort to bring to bear a model that John Dewey had suggested, a pre-conventional, conventional, post-conventional. And I thought that that was a big part of this problem, that, because then, I mean, it fit in with kind of the ideology, which we still have today, that, there's this sort of merely conventional morality, and then there are those anointed ones that go beyond conventions, and they're principled and they're philosophical and so on. Problem is that in my longitudinal work, I was discovering that it was hard to find people who were in this rarefied realm, at least in terms of Kohlberg's longitudinal sample. So I started to rethink about what I was seeing in the data, and thinking about that, especially vis-a-vis what I knew from Piaget's work. And Piaget was he wrote this seminal book back in the 30s called The Moral Judgment of the Child. And I thought, there's a lot that, maybe we should go back to what Piaget did and rethink all of this. And that's really the gist of my sense that the Dewey pre-conventional, conventional, post-conventional tripartite overlay it was obscuring and rendering the whole thing very elitist. And so that was really the origin of my effort to overhaul Kohlberg stages. And I can tell you a story about that.
Sure.
Needless to say, there's some tension here, because Kohlberg was my boss, right? In effect, I mean, it was out of his large research grant that I was getting paid, and I was, looking back, I was really kind of nervy to do this. I wrote up my critique in the Harvard Educational Review, and I had the galleys to it. That's what we had those days, galleys, and I shared them with Kohlberg. I said, I'm writing this, and there may be an opportunity for you to kind of provide some commentary, and would you like to look at it? And said, of course, and he put it in his briefcase. And the next day I saw him, and I said, did you get a chance to look at what I wrote? He said, yes, I did. And he said, how'd you like to, let's talk about how'd you like to come to lunch, my treat. I thought, wow, he must have really liked what I wrote. He's treating me to lunch. So anyways, we go down to a place off Boylston Street. It was called Grendel's Den. I think it's still around. And I'm sort of looking out the window, but I'm really kind of, I can't eat very well. I'm waiting for what Kohlberg's going to say. So if he takes a bite of his sandwich, this is sort of a vegan place, and a vegetarian sandwich filled with all kinds of good things, and takes a bite out of it and reaches down to his satchel and gets out the article, and he says, well, it's clear that you're becoming an independent thinker. And I thought, well, yeah. I mean, I guess that's a good thing. And then he said, the soft money doesn't last forever. And he said, we're going to be winding up the project, and it's really time for you to start to get out your Vetus, to start looking around for a solid tenure track kind of opportunity for the long run. You're starting a family. This is important to do. And I thought, well, that's probably true. And I was very happy in my little cocoon, but I was thinking, well, he's right. So the upshot of that is actually good, because 2 years later, I got the offer from Ohio State, and I've been here ever since. But in the back of my mind, I still have this question of what was going on there. Was Kohlberg just encouraging me to think of the longer term and what would happen beyond Harvard, or was he firing me? It's
It's a good question.
maybe it's a little both. Maybe it's a little bit of both. And he did told me subsequently, by the way, that I could be right. And he did write a friendly critique of my position vis-a-vis his and so on. So, but I never, I guess that question will never be totally resolved as to the dynamics of what was going on at Grendel's Den many years ago. So that would have been like 1978, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how did your research change when you got to Ohio State in '79, I believe?
Um, well, it was clear, it was made clear to me that Ohio State is a research university and that teaching and committee service are valued, but that it was really programmatic research that was going to be the most weighty component in terms of getting tenure. And so I already had the theoretical work, the revisionist theoretical work that I was doing. And then I added to that some more applied work, and we can get into that also. That's the start of my work with which a program that we came to call the Equip program, and it's something that we're continuing to this day for juvenile, mainly for juvenile offenders. And I can tell you more about that. But so that was really and so my both basic and applied programmatic research, fortunately, was sufficient for me to attain tenure 5 or 6 years later. I had some credit because I had been out for a while, but I think it was in like '85 that I got tenure and then promotion to full and so on. So I've been very appreciative and grateful to Ohio State and many very talented graduate students that I've worked with along the way, and some colleagues that have been helpful and stimulating and so on.
Awesome. Yeah, can we dive into the Equip program? Can you briefly tell us how did it come to be? Because I think it's a very interesting program. I'm not sure many professors have this type of I mean, it's part of your research, right? But this type of work where it happens very independently, then it gets like adopted by a bunch of other people, like both nationally and internationally. So can you go into that? Because I find it a very, very interesting and well done program.
Well, I appreciate that. Um, I didn't realize, but I was a little arrogant, I think, when I first came to Ohio State, because I was thinking that, well, the problem with juvenile offending, juvenile delinquents, is that they're developmentally delayed in their moral judgment, and so all we have to do is just remedy this developmental delay, and we'll see a diminishment of their offending behavior. Well, it didn't work that way. I did develop some curriculum materials, and I thought that I was making progress through, providing opportunities for social perspective taking and a deeper basis for moral values. And I can tell you a story in that connection. But I wasn't getting much by way of behavioral improvement. I mean, they were still engaged in, petty things like shoplifting and so on, and more serious things pertaining to gangs. And so I was kind of discouraged. And apropos of that, before I continue my story there, I will mention about Lewis, because was working at a school for, they called them severe behavior handicapped kids. They were basically had been deemed incorrigible from the mainstream Columbus city schools. And so here they were in this Clearbrook school. And so I was talking about with Lewis, and I said, you know, do you think it's important for people not to take things that belong to others and to obey the law and to help others and so on? And Lewis started banging the table. He said, "It's Dr. Gibbs. It's very important. It's so important. I can't tell you how important." I said, "Well, I can see that you feel very strongly about that, Lewis. Can you tell me why that's so important?" He said, "Because there might not be people around. There could be cameras, you know." And I'm thinking, I'm not sure that's the most mature basis for understanding the importance of these moral values. So, and that's essentially what we're talking about with developmental delay is, even though there's a sort of a surface attribution of importance and against stealing and so on, that there's a relatively superficial or concrete or immature understanding and self-centered basically kind of understanding for why these are. I mean, there's no reference to the selfishness of theft, the non-reversibility of it. You wouldn't want people to steal your things, loss of trust in the community, chaos in society, all those more mature reasons. You just don't hear that. And so there's the need for remedying the developmental delay in terms of the moral reasoning aspect of moral judgment. But still, to get back to my story, I wasn't finding the accompanying behavioral change. Now, around this time, in 79, 80, 81, there was a commission in interprofessional education that was putting together a workshop. And they put me together. They asked if I wanted to participate as a workshop leader, and I said sure. And they put me together with someone who was more on the practitioner end of things, and it was Bud Potter. And so Bud and I got together, and I was telling Bud, well, I've been trying to do this work with equipping juvenile offenders, or high-risk adolescents, let's call them, with more mature understanding for moral values, but I haven't seen much by way of behavioral change. And Bud was meanwhile saying his frustration was that he thought he had put together, thanks to guided group interaction and positive peer culture, an approach that that got them serious about trying to change their behavior, but it just would typically degenerate into self-centered name calling and so we're starting to put our notes together and realizing that I had something that seemed to be good to equip at-risk adolescents, and he had something that seemed to be good to motivate them. But we were both frustrated because we started to realize we needed each other's approach. And that was really the start of Equip, realizing that you have to do something along the lines of amenability to treatment, or, positive cultural change, or what have you with the peer group, before you start any kind of cognitive behavioral curriculum. And vice versa, you have to do both. There's kind of a synergy between them. So that's really the pitch that we made at the conference. And so that's kind of the way Equip got started. And then we've got it's going to be in January of 2024, but we have a revised and expanded edition of the Equip program that we're all excited about. So it's been a journey for over a quarter century, and I think we have a contribution to make along those lines.
Well, congrats for having a program that's been lasting for that long. Most obviously don't get off the start, so big congrats to you.
Yeah,
I do
you
have a
can't
question.
accuse us. Yeah, you can't accuse us of rushing into the second edition. It's been 25
No.
years.
No, I do have a question though. So, if you looked at juvenile delinquency, or high risk adolescents, as you call them, if you were like a clinician, you would have a different inclination as to why they're behaving the way they do. You might have like a retroactive, or like childhood trauma approach, or something along those lines, right? Whereas
Mhm.
for you, you had the inclination that moral rehabilitation would have been the way to actually ameliorate their behavior and and reduce their cognitive distortions. And I'm just wondering what gave you that like hint that it might be that's the not the cure necessarily, but the like the antidote to how they view the world and how they behave with themselves and others.
Um, Apropos of that, I was struck by some work by a clinical psychologist named Stanton Staminow, and he's also gone through 4 editions. Moral Development Reality has gone through 4 editions. His book also has gone through 4 editions, Inside the Criminal Mind, and it's kind of controversial, but I thought it was making a lot of sense. And I call them self-serving cognitive distortions. He calls them thinking errors, but he argues that you have to be very careful with your approach. And if you use a traditional clinical approach, where you're approaching it from the point of view of the high risk adolescent as having been a victim of various um, you know parenting community type uh, um, you know adversities, um, that it's there's some truth to that, of course, but if that's your approach in therapy, you're running the risk of feeding into one of these self-serving, distortions of, kind of like, yes, I'm a victim, and the only reason that I'm here and you're not is that I got caught, and it's society's fault, and and I'm not perfect, but basically I just want to get out of here and live my life and so on. And so you're kind of feeding into a tendency they have anyway to want to externalize blame. And so, it doesn't mean you have to come off as some kind of ogre, but it does mean, Sam and I argued, that you have to give them the message that they have the potential to be better, and to live lives of responsible thinking and acting, and so not to dwell upon a strong empathy-based approach where you're enabling them to sort of perceive themselves as victims, because I think Sam and I was right that that's counterproductive. So anyway, I don't know if that quite answers your question, but I was at that time when I was working up my contribution, and Bud agreed, by the way, that really didn't want to quite go there. We wanted to acknowledge adversity, but we wanted to be careful not to get into the why question along that line of some sort of self-pity, because it wasn't helpful as far as the effectiveness of an intervention program is concerned.
Okay, so I guess you were focused on some type of present slash future oriented rehab, right? If that makes
Right.
sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. And in terms of the analysis that I got out of Piaget and Kohlberg was that this developmental delay had to do with a dearth of social perspective taking opportunities. That these kids basically grew up in erratic homes for the most part, authoritarian rather than authoritative kinds of parenting, abuse, neglect. Um, and that so that what they really needed was opportunities to really take into account other people's perspectives, not as objects to overcome, but as people who are subjects in their own right. And I can mention, by way of another anecdote, an early meeting that we did in the EQUIP program that kind of illustrates how this group work that Bud was so good at, how that addressed that. Um, but anyway, so that was the idea, is to think of things in terms of remedial social perspective taking, and I to this day, I mean, that's a big theme. And then also uh, very non-relativistic kind of mindset where you're very aware of these self-serving tendencies, and you teach the juveniles to identify when they're doing that, when they're making what Seminar calls these thinking errors, and how to correct them. And so some of the exercises, especially with the anger management component, some of the exercises are along that line of, now, wait a minute, what self-serving errors are you making in the way you're thinking in the situation and so on, and how do you need to correct them? So again, we have a very non-relativistic kind of approach where there's responsible thinking, accurate thinking, and versus self-servingly distorted thinking. And that's a big feature of the way we do cognitive behavioral, is to emphasize those needs. And again, that's really Stan Samanow's influence on the program.
Okay, awesome. And please, could you share that anecdote about social perspective taking that you mentioned just about a minute ago?
Yeah. So uh, I call it Max. Let's call him Mac. So in the guided group interaction, mutual help kind of meeting, the way it works is a group member, you have somewhere between 8 and 12 adolescents who are in this case incarcerated, and they go around and decide who's going to be awarded the meeting. That's the terminology. And in this case, Mac was awarded the meeting. And so Mac's the incident that Mac wanted to talk about was that he got a write-up and he didn't think it was fair. He was angry at the being written up. And so the group is asking him, well, what happened? He said he was carrying around a bag, and a staff member said that she needed to inspect his bag. And he got very angry at that, even though he knew that this was facility policy, that because of possible contraband, carrying bags had to be inspected. And they said, well, so the group said, well, why'd you get so angry? He said, because I had pictures of my grandmother in this bag, and I couldn't get this meant a lot to me, and I guess he was afraid that the staff member might confiscate these photos, which the group members said she just wanted to, he was assuming the worst, and to use the way we talk about the thinking areas, he was assuming that the staff member was going to confiscate these photos. And it was also being self-centered because he wasn't taking into account the perspective of the staff member who was just carrying out under an understandable institutional policy. And there was some developmental delay there too, because he wasn't taking the larger perspective of the functional necessity for a juvenile correctional institution to check for contraband and so on. So the group was helping him with all of this, and it was salutary because he started to get less self-righteously angry, and he started to see that it was entirely appropriate for him to get this right up. And he started to perceive, we would argue, the staff member not as an object to be resisted and overcome, but as a subject, a person in her own right. This is very Kantian, right? And so he grew, I think. And in the process of helping Mac, I think some of his fellow group members grew also with their issues. And I think one reason that the group was not, didn't degenerate into the name calling and so on that Bud had found in his work was that we were preparing them with another kind of meeting, the equipment meetings, in which they were learning about perspective taking and growing in that respect. So they had the tools, as it were, to help Mac see the self-centered nature of his reaction, the self-serving distortions that he was doing, the need to correct those distortions, the need to practice more step-by-step social skills, et cetera, et cetera. So that's I use that anecdote, that incident with Mac a lot to try to elucidate just what the EQUIP program is all about, and how we try to not only motivate juveniles to make a change, but also equip them to be able to do it.
Okay. So now I'm curious as to what are the results of the EQUIP program exactly? Like, does it increase or decrease recidivism rates?
We got data on that. One thing in Minnesota, there was a study in the early days of EQUIP. We went out there, and no hard data in Minnesota, but John Handy, the director of the program, said that the year after they implemented EQUIP program, that recidivism was cut in half. And that's also, by the way, what one of my graduate students found when we did our first EQUIP program at Buckeye Youth Center, was that recidivism went down by about half. The main place elsewhere where we've implemented EQUIP in the Netherlands, results vary. according to Jan von Westerlock, places where they do it right, as it were, recidivism goes down substantially. There's one institution where the program was ineffective, and I wondered what's going on, and I discovered that the Dutch in this particular facility had shall we say, a casual idea about what implementing the program meant. And it was kind of shocking that they weren't implementing. I mean, they were saying they were doing equip, but they weren't. I mean, they were paying lip service to it, but for example, with the social skills training, the group leader, the staff member would model with one of the juveniles the social skill, and that's it. I mean, he would just model it and then just assume that they would pick it up. It wasn't doing what you're supposed to do, which is then have each group member come up and go through the steps and with group feedback and then practice it and so on. So obviously, if you don't do the program, you don't get effectiveness. So we write about all this in our 2024 new edition that's should be out in less than, we're hoping it'll be out in January actually of next year. So but anyways, I don't know if that fully answers your question, but
No, it
uh,
does.
yeah.
Okay. And can you touch more about how does empathy, like what role does empathy have, or social perspective taking, as you call it, have in terms of improving or maturing someone's moral development or moral perspective taking?
Yeah, the empathy side of it. Here's another historical story. When going back to the my first time at Harvard in graduate school, I needed for my dissertation, I needed to measure parental nurturance, and someone at University of Michigan named Martin Hoffman had sort of the measure that everyone was using, and he was kind enough to send it to me. And that was the start of my interest in this work by Martin L. Hoffman. And I started to realize that if Kohlberg was the cognitive guru, as it were, based on Piaget, the intellectual dimension missing in Freud, the cognitive side of morality and moral development, that Hoffman was the whatever you would say, not really guru, but the giant in terms of the affective or the feeling side, the empathy side, the caring side, and these two sort of areas, aspects of morality, the cognitive and the emotional. They've been in moral philosophy. You mentioned about moral philosophy. The moral domain is often characterized in terms of the right and wrong, justice, fairness, reciprocity, consistency, and so on, and the good, which is like beneficence, benevolence, caring, empathy, and so on. And so that's on the theoretical side. That's what I started to see as I, left Harvard for Ohio State. I picked back up with Marty Hoffman's work and started to see him as the other giant who was needed to understand moral development, and a more kind of a less dramatic and more positive aspect of the affective side. That it wasn't just Freud, the raw id, we're all neurotic because we have to repress and sublimate, these raw affective feelings. There was also this positive side of empathy and growth beyond the superficial in terms of empathic understanding. So anyway, that's where I started to get a more balanced view and thinking of the right and the good and how they both involve a kind of a growth beyond the superficial, and that also rounded out the applied work a little. To when you talk about perspective taking, we're not just talking about cognitive perspective taking, we're also talking about an emotional a process in terms of deeper caring for, for others. Like, as with the Mac example, with the staff member seeing her as a person in her own right with feelings and legitimate expectations and so on.
Okay, so then I
Yeah.
assume you kind of put that into you put that theoretical framework into your equip program where it has a cognitive component and has a affective or emotional component, right? So to you, I'm assuming that to to rehabilitate moral stunting, it has to have both components for it to be successfully done, or can one kind of rehabilitate the other? So let's say you heal a cognitive distortion before you heal some type of social, like not but like some deficit in social perspective taking.
Well, it is true that I guess I would try to, I think we do both, but it is true that, we talk a lot about responsible thinking and acting. And I guess the assumption is that if you're doing the responsible thinking in terms of perspective taking and correcting cognitive distortions and so on, that the feelings aspect of it will kind of come along in the wake, you know. But theoretically, I think of the affective or the the empathic as just as fundamental as the cognitive. There's affective primacy and cognitive primacy, but it's true in our applied work. We really focus, maybe because you can get a handle on it better. We focus more on the cognitive side, and CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. I mean, that's really what we're doing there, and there's a reason why that's popular, because that's what you can get a handle on it.
Hmm. Okay. And just as like another question about equip, are there some type of participants who are very resistant to this treatment or this program and they just seem to either not want to participate or they simply cannot be rehabilitated as one might conclude?
Well, yeah. In fact, with this mutual help approach, it's also called guided group interaction or positive peer culture. Uh, but it acquainted me with the stages of group development, and actually the first stage is storming. There's storming, norming, performing, etc. And the storming stage is precisely where there's this resistance that you have to overcome. And there are techniques for trying to enable the group to grow beyond the storming phase. Yeah, obviously you don't want to have totally recalcitrant high risk adolescents when you're starting the group. And usually you can find some adolescents who are already more amenable to treatment and change and so on. So, but yeah, that can be a problem. Um, are there cases like we have an adult version, and there are definitely cases where there are adult offenders who are just beyond the pale, and you just, it's um and so we're not claiming that everyone in a high risk population is going to miraculously change toward responsible thinking and acting, but a surprising number can actually. Is that would be our claim.
Okay, okay. And what does the future look like? Do you want to bring this type of programming into, let's say, like late middle school or early high school, since it's a bit located into type of extreme behavior, might we call it? Being a criminal offender is kind of, statistically speaking, is on a very outlier type of thing. Would you want to bring this to somewhat more of a not normal population, because I hate that type of talk, but I mean like some type of population where they aren't committing some type of crimes and antisocial behaviors.
Yeah, in fact, and this here I want to give a nod to Anne-Marie DiBiase at Brock University, because this is like 20 years ago now. She approached this and indicated that she wanted to do a prevention version of Equip for especially for high schools. And the result is that we do have some products out there, some prevention versions of Equip that have been used in some schools. So definitely, that's one thing that's already we've already thought about and implemented. Um, and then what we're doing in the forthcoming second edition is we're talking about not just residential agencies but community agencies, and because that's really the trend that we've seen in the past few decades, is away from kind of 24/7 residential commitment in a juvenile correctional facility, to more of these community agencies. And so we've given some thought in the new edition to what equip looks like if you're in a usually non-residential community agency, and the need to bring out significant others in the juvenile's life, and kind of co-enlist family members, but maybe others as well who are also significant for the juvenile, and it actually involve them in the program as well. So that's probably talk about current and future direction. I mean, I think that's where we would see the big thrust for equip. But not that it's still, not that it's not helpful with, adult offender institutions or juvenile offender institutions, but how can it be adapted and be made useful in this other context, this more community-based context?
Okay. And do you see this program being implemented in non-Western countries?
We do get some queries in some non-Western countries, and in fact, there's someone in an Eastern European country that I already offered when the new edition comes out to. They seem pretty serious in wanting to implement the program, and so I said that when our new edition comes out, I'll send them a complimentary copy. The main thing, though, I think this, I mentioned Jan van Westerlack. He's a big promoter in the Netherlands and Belgium, and so I definitely want to get a copy into the hands of Jan, and so we see some spreading of the program in those areas. And the UK, one of our co-authors, Peter Langdon, uses an adaptation of equip in his work with dual diagnosis adults. Dual diagnosis being adults with issues, especially autism spectrum issues, but others as well, where they've committed felonies, and then what do you do? And so he's adapted the program to be usable with that special population. So so I'd say the UK, the Netherlands, Belgium, and then occasionally, as I mentioned, there is this one Eastern European country, might be Bulgaria, where they seem pretty serious about it. So, and of course, Anne Marie's in Canada for mainly for the prevention versions. So, and I think they're still using it in Minnesota, actually. So there are various places around the world.
Okay, well that's great to hear. And so it sounds like it's becoming a bit more tailored to each specific country or part of a country where they're implementing it, right? So that's very very nice to see. Do you plan to have like a like I guess book or paper that kind of synthesizes all the data from cross culturally speaking about the efficacy of the equip program, or has that already been done, or is that going to be part of like the new edition?
As part of the new edition, and toward the end of the first chapter, we talk about the various outcome evaluation studies that have been done. So yeah, that's something that we've tried to review.
Okay, and can you speak to that, or are the results still a little confidential at this time?
I wouldn't say confidential. I mean, I mentioned anecdotally some things that in Minnesota and some of my work that my students, Leonard Lehman way back, and then more recently Devlin. Well, I can't remember her first name. Anyways, some of my students that have done, um, and then the work in the Netherlands. So we try to put that together, and then a longtime colleague of mine actually visited our program here in Columbus, and so it was very complimentary. And so of course we mentioned that in the new edition. Clark Power at Notre Dame. So we put that together to the extent that it's not. It'd be nice to have a really large scale, completely independent outcome evaluation study, but it hasn't happened yet. So
Okay, well, always a project for the future. Should funding
Mhm.
suffice?
Yeah, yeah, right.
So I guess I have a theoretical question to ask you, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
So you wrote this book. It's a really good book, Moral Development and Reality, and you have a very synthetic approach where you're really synthesizing key elements of many theories, such as specifically Hoffman, Kohlberg, and Haidt. And I'm just wondering, since your analysis is very retrospective in the sense that you look back and you're putting it into the present, into the future, what do you think the future of moral development slash moral psychology looks like with these theories in mind moving forward? Like, is there a way to actually kind of merge it all together, or are things still going to be kind of mutually irreducible, as you mentioned?
Yeah, good question. Eh, I don't, developmental psychology, I agree with Bob Sigler that it's become more oriented to, you might say, bits and pieces, and it's he in I quote his blurb for the 2019 edition. I don't know if you can see this one, but he expresses his frustration. He's at Columbia now, Bob Siebert, and but anyway, he wrote something that I would agree with. At a time when the study of moral development is more about describing and explaining details of the trees than about characterizing the forest as a whole, Gibbs provides a much needed integration of what's known and what remains to be learned in this important area, integrating the distinct perspectives of Kohlberg, Hoffman, Haidt, and Bloom, as well as providing unique insights of his own. This book is a remarkable achievement. Well, needless to say, I was appreciative of his comment there. But the part about the trees and the forest, I mean, I guess that's how I see my contribution is you might say I'm sort of a classic developmental psychologist, as far as wanting to look at the big picture of things and so on. And maybe the field will come back to the classic, question addressing the basic issues, the basic, going back to Roger Brown, let's put it that way, and really thinking about the field and the larger issues that it's trying to address, and as opposed to what you see so much in the journals these days, which is more and more about less and less and little methodological controversies about you know very specific aspects of this or that study. So yeah, maybe my day will return, but you know and that would be my vision for the future, is for the field to get back to the larger questions and concerns that and the other thing, by the way, apropos of that, is for development and reality. As you know, I do a lot with the reality part toward the end of the book, and talk about whether there's a deeper reality, and that gets into the near-death experiences, and how does that fit into because Kohlberg was trying to get at that. He talked about a cosmic perspective, and as a sort of a metaphorical stage seven, and I really think he was overreaching with the idea of the stage characterization, especially if you're talking about a Piagetian stage characterization. So that's when I talk about existential development as a phase of in the lifespan beyond standard development. So and I'm writing what I call my existential memoirs, and so I reflect about my issues, my challenges here at Ohio State, and how I negotiated this controversy where I'm writing about this um, far out phenomenon, and how did that sit with colleagues, so anyway, fortunately, I mean, obviously I survived, and I'm here to tell about it, and so I've sort of, and I think, by the way, I think that there's enough now literature out there that's taking the phenomenon seriously, is not just some sort of fantasy or hallucination, that it, I, we'll see. But I think this so-called, this seemingly far out phenomenon and kindred phenomena, we'll see how things develop. But I do think that in that big picture sense that we were talking about, there should be room even for things like this, for even uh, within existential development, there should be room for psychologists to even ponder spiritual questions and how do we, what is the nature of reality vis-a-vis moral development, and can we get in touch with something that's a deeper reality, and so on. The students seem to perk up and appreciate that aspect of the book, and but it's true, you don't find it in the current pages of child development or developmental psych, or what have you. It's not you don't see a lot of journal articles. You see some, but not in the mainstream developmental psychology journals. Not yet, anyway.
Yeah, I gotta say, when I got to chapter 9 and 10, when you talk about near death experiences and going beyond reality, and more importantly, I would say beyond the theories, right? So, like, like going above and beyond the material, what is it all? What is the ultimate sense of morality and existence and reality? I found it to be intensely unique, and it's something that's very I think a lot of psychologists, which is fine, it's hard to actually have a good grasp on these things. It's they get deeply like shy about it, right? Because it becomes very equivocal and it becomes very um, speculative. So, and I'm glad you went into that realm because it's unique, and I think it's also very important, right? Because you brought up a lot of good questions about like what's the actual purpose of being moral in the sense, like does it tap into something beyond the things that we can kind of perceive and touch in like our empirical sense. So yeah, I really appreciate those chapters. I gotta say, massive props to you for doing that.
Thank you.
So yeah, I think this is a good place to stop since you said you had about a cutoff time at this time. Is there anything you would like to promote before we end off the episode?
Well, shamelessly promote. Uh, I mentioned that the new edition of the Equip program is it's in typeset as we speak, and it was going to come out in, they were saying October, November, and I said, well, why don't we just delay that a little bit, because do we really want the new edition to come out in November, say, or December? And then in a month or so, it's like last year's book. You know what I mean? 2024. Oh, that was
True.
2023. So I think they see my point, and so Research Press, I think, is now thinking of a release date in January of 2024. So we'll have to delay a little bit before it comes out, but I'm really excited about it. That it'll be fresh, cutting edge for a whole 12 months.
That's
So
awesome. That's awesome. Anything else?
thank you.
I assume you have your textbook as well.
Uh, yeah, and it's not impossible that there could be a fifth edition. But the thing is, there would have to be a reason. You have to have a rationale or a justification for something that's going to be substantive in the new edition. So, like the fourth edition, I didn't put his name in the title, but I really owe much to Paul Bloom because he was challenging Hoffman,
Mm-hmm.
and so I was able to say, well, there has to be an answer to this challenge from this. He was at Yale at the time, Paul Bloom, and so the my Oxford editor, Abby Gross, she bought that argument and she got me the contract for the fourth edition, which came out in 2019. But there would have to be somebody else coming along. I mean, Jonathan Haidt came along for the third edition, and then as a rationale, and then Paul Bloom, and so I don't know. I'd love to do a fifth edition. There would have to be a rationale for it. I don't have one yet. The book went through 16 years and 4 editions. Could be that that's the end of it, or we'll see. I'm certainly open to doing a fifth edition if I can construct a rationale.
Awesome. Well, I think this is a good place to stop. So,
Yeah.
Dr. John Gibbs, thank you very much for taking the time. I really appreciate this, and this conversation was very fun.
Well, thanks. I appreciate your interest, and I think that it's helpful to me also to think through what we've done and where we want to go from here and so on. So I appreciate your you're taking the time to put this together and to interview me about these things.
Glad to be a part of that process. Thanks. Thank you for listening to this episode. To support this podcast, please subscribe to my YouTube channel and rate it 5 stars on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. If you enjoyed this conversation and would like to dive deeper into the topics we discussed, I would recommend reading Dr. Gibbs' book to have a grand overview of moral psychology and its development. Martin Hoffman's book, Empathy and Moral Development, Implications for Caring and Justice, to understand the role of empathy in morality, and for affect and pluralism, read the various papers by Jonathan Haidt, specifically discussed the new synthesis in moral psychology and moral foundations theory, the pragmatic validity of moral pluralism. All these authors have a unique contribution to the field, and you will learn many things about morality and yourself when reading their theories. Take care, and see you next time.